The text sent at 2:14 a.m. was only 2 words long. He broke my arm, but Lisandro DePaul, the quiet ruler of New York's shadow economy, replied with 2 more. I'm coming. The dangerous part wasn't his vengeance. It was the terrifying efficiency. By the time his SUV crossed the bridge, the abuser's life was already destroyed by 6 simultaneous, untraceable phone calls, yet Lisandro still hadn't touched him. You're not watching a rescue. You're watching a reckoning delivered by a brother, so he owns justice, and the only question left is, what happens when that cold silence finally breaks? Lisandro didn't speed through the city. He didn't race the heavy black SUV across the Queensboro Bridge. His driver held the limit exactly. There was no rage in Lisandro's expression, only a chilling, disciplined calm. For 20 years, he had operated on the principle that the loudest man in the room was usually the weakest. True power was silence, preparedness, and absolute finality. His fingers tapped once against the rich leather of the center console. In that brief moment, the 6 threads of destruction had been pulled taut across the city, all aimed at the man who was foolish enough to put his hands on a DePaul. His surveillance team had already identified the apartment. His legal people had pulled every police record associated with the abuser. His personal doctor was en route to Chiara's location. His security chief had eyes on the target, logging every move. His financial team had frozen every account connected to the man. And one specific call had been placed to a man in federal service who owed Lisandro DePaul his freedom. Power didn't rush. Power arrived prepared to delete a problem from existence. Chiara Roberto sat on the edge of her worn couch, her spine rigid against the cheap cushions. Her arm, snapped with a sound she would never forget, sharp, wet, final, was clumsily wrapped in a towel, the swelling already visible and throbbing. She looked smaller, exhausted, her spirit hollowed out by months of silent fear she'd endured to keep her brother out of her life. She'd changed her last name and kept her world small and unremarkable, believing distance was the only true protection from the DePaul name. But distance hadn't protected her tonight. The look in his eyes after the snap, not panic, not regret, but cold satisfaction, had been the final breaking point. She realized if she stayed silent, she wouldn't survive the next time. A key turned in the lock. Not forced, but precise, as if the door had been waiting for him. Lisandro walked in. He wasn't dressed in a suit, but a simple, high-quality cashmere sweater and dark trousers, the attire of a man who commanded not by show, but by sheer presence. He took in the apartment, the turned-over chair, the shattered glass near the kitchen, the fear radiating off the woman on the couch, in a single, clinical glance. He knelt in front of her. Slowly, deliberately. The floor creaked under his weight. "Who did this?" he asked quietly. She flinched, not from his voice, which held no anger, but from the weight of the question itself. It forced her to acknowledge the chaos he represented. "I didn't want this," she whispered, her throat tight with shame and pain. "I didn't want you involved." Lisandro's eyes, the color of winter ice, fixed on the bruise already forming high on her collarbone. His voice remained a calm, terrifying murmur. "You didn't involve me, Chiara," he said. He did. The man who broke her arm believed 2 things: that no one powerful cared about a simple woman named Chiara Roberto, and that her silence meant his safety. He was wrong. This wasn't the first time, Chiara confessed, the words a raw whisper. The texts, the isolation, the control. He broke my world first. The arm was just the final consequence. Lisandro listened without interruption. When she finished, he exhaled, a sound of profound finality. He didn't ask the abuser's name, he already knew it, his security chief having provided it minutes after the text. Lisandro rose, towering over her. He didn't need to touch the man to exact vengeance. He just needed to remove the systems that kept him safe. He turned toward the dark window, looking out over the sleeping city where a carefully constructed life was, at that very moment, dissolving. "That window is closed," Lisandro said, his voice stripping away every shred of hope the abuser thought he had left. "This ends today." Chiara Roberto, 2 years prior, had sworn she would never involve her brother. That vow was the foundation of the quiet, anonymous life she'd painstakingly built. She changed her last name and chose two small, unassuming jobs, deliberately shrinking her world so people wouldn't connect her, or the soft contours of her life, to the cold, violent machine of the DePaul empire. Lisandro himself had warned her years ago, a rare moment of sibling affection masked by ruthlessness. Distance is protection, little sister. Use it. She took that advice as gospel, believing the only way to save her soul was to disappear from his shadow. When she met the man who broke her arm, his attentiveness hadn't looked like isolation, it had looked like love. It was the careful erosion of her friendships, the quiet freezing of her bank access, the subtle shift in her world, until he was all she had left. He hadn't forced her to stay silent. He had merely convinced her that no one else would listen. But distance hadn't protected her tonight. Now, as she waited on the couch, her fractured arm throbbing, Lisandro was already moving through his world, silent and lethal. While Chiara fought the rising tide of pain and regret, Lisandro's SUV ate up the final miles, a black, unstoppable shadow. His internal rule, the one mandate that superseded all business, all threats, all laws, was the only thing driving him. Family is untouchable. The abuser had not just broken an arm, he had desecrated the one sanctuary Lisandro DePaul allowed himself to maintain. The SUV slowed as it turned onto her street. Lisandro's gaze was fixed ahead, crossing the invisible boundary between his powerful, dark world and her humble, broken one. The silence in the car was absolute, a coiled spring about to release years of pent-up protection. Lisandro DePaul had arrived. His power was no longer miles away, it was on her doorstep. Lisandro DePaul entered the apartment not like a hurricane, but like a change in atmospheric pressure. There were no shouts, no security detail barging in, only the heavy thud of the front door closing and the sound of his expensive shoes on the linoleum. He was already working. A moment after he entered, a quiet knock came at the door. It was Lisandro's doctor, Dr. Fazio, who moved with the swift, silent competence of someone who knew better than to ask questions. Within minutes, Chiara's arm was splinted with professional precision, the immediate, blinding pain muted by a quick injection. Lisandro watched the medical process from the doorway, his silhouette blocking the meager light. He never rushed the doctor, nor did he offer any instruction. He simply observed, establishing control through presence. When Dr. Fazio was done and had been silently escorted out, Lisandro finally approached Chiara on the couch. He knelt in front of her. The movement was slow, deliberate, placing his dark, tailored clothing in stark contrast with the cheap, cluttered apartment and her bloodied towel. It was the only time he had ever lowered himself in her presence, and the gesture felt more powerful than any threat. He was eye level with her pain. "Who did this?" he repeated, his voice low and devoid of inflection, a sound like cold marble. Chiara, eased by the medication and overwhelmed by his sudden, absolute authority, finally broke. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed earlier began to stream down her face. "I didn't want this," she choked out. "I didn't want you involved." Lisandro reached out, not to comfort, but to gently touch the edge of the swelling visible beneath the splint, his gaze clinical. "You didn't involve me," he stated, his voice a single, unforgiving line of truth. "He did." The sheer, terrifying confidence of his command calmed her fear even as it heightened her terror of him. She saw his control not through his words, but through his actions, the immediate doctor, the silent security detail outside, the knowledge that, even now, the abuser was facing an invisible, meticulously orchestrated collapse. Lisandro hadn't rushed to violence because he hadn't needed to. "He believes he's safe," Lisandro murmured, looking past Chiara at the empty space where the abuser's things should have been. "He believes silence guarantees immunity. He doesn't understand that the delay is the punishment. The systems that keep men like him alive, tax codes, police reports, bank accounts, those are already gone. I haven't touched him, Chiara, but his world is already dust." Lisandro straightened, the chair scraping slightly behind him as he turned toward the door. He had his answer. His name, Chiara, Lisandro commanded, his voice now a decisive cutoff. Tell me his name. Lisandro held the abuser's name, Ethan Caldwell, in the air for a moment, tasting the commonness of it, the contradiction to the violence it represented. He had the name, but he needed the history. Tell me everything you haven't told the police, Chiara. Everything you didn't tell me. Chiara took a shaky breath, the pain medication dulling the throbbing but not the shame. She had to confess the escalation, the slow, insidious psychological warfare. This wasn't the first incident. The broken arm was just the savage finale. She began to speak, her voice gaining a desperate clarity. She described the isolating texts disguised as concern, the casual threats about her job, the calculated erosion of her friendships until he was her only connection to the world. She detailed the missing spare keys and the unnerving realization that he was moving through her space unseen. Lisandro listened without a single flicker of emotion, his terrifying outward calm in stark contrast to the boiling internal fury she knew he must be suppressing. He heard an echo of a terrible past, a lesson burned into his own soul years ago when he missed the small, creeping signs of danger surrounding someone else he cared about. This wasn't just a sister in peril. This was a second chance at protecting the innocent from a quiet, insidious predator. He thought silence was safety, Lisandro said when she finished, stepping away from the couch. He thought he could operate in the shadows, destroying your life brick by brick. Lisandro's goal shifted instantly. Retaliation was easy. It was a quick bullet and a deep hole. But that was messy, and it left no lesson. To end the cycle permanently, to honor the emotional strength Chiara had shown in simply surviving, the abuser could not simply disappear. He had to be publicly destroyed, his crimes exposed, his immunity revoked. The punishment had to be as public as Chiara's pain had been private. You won't disappear him, Chiara whispered, reading the cold calculation in his profile. Lisandro turned back, his expression grim and unwavering. No, he confirmed. I will not. Disappearing him is too fast. Too clean. It allows his silence to persist, and it allows men like him to continue believing they are untouchable. He looked directly at her, laying the final plan bare. You chose exposure by sending that text. We will honor that choice. He will be remembered for what he is, not what I did to him. He will face every system he thought he was above. Lisandro DePaul had decided. The abuser would not vanish, he would be exposed. Ethan Caldwell's world began to unravel not with a bang, but with a series of tiny, inescapable bureaucratic disasters. He woke up expecting the usual silent shame and residual control. Instead, his phone was dead, his bank cards declined at the gas station, and his employer called, advising him to take an immediate leave of absence due to an urgent, unannounced audit.
He didn't know why yet.
He only knew that the untouchable infrastructure he relied on had vanished. The tax authorities, the banking compliance division, the sealed indictments waiting for a signature. Lisandro's 6 points of attack were hitting simultaneously, erasing Ethan's security and influence before the sun had fully risen. Ethan was cornered hours later, not by men in masks, but by two impeccably dressed security chiefs who presented him with a civil subpoena and quietly escorted him to an off-the-books, soundproofed room in a downtown office tower. Lisandro was waiting. He was sitting at a glass table, reading a file filled with Ethan's meticulous records of abuse and control. You don't know why you're here, do you, Ethan? Lisandro asked, without looking up. His voice was conversational, which was far more terrifying than a shout. Ethan, white-faced and trembling, managed a strangled refusal. I don't know who you are. This is harassment. Lisandro finally raised his eyes, fixing Ethan with that cold, assessing gaze. He slid the file across the table. A photo of Chiara with her arm in a splint sat on top. You didn't break her arm, Lisandro stated, his voice stripped of all mercy. You broke the rule that keeps men like you alive. Lisandro stood, towering over the shaking man. You believed silence meant safety. You believed a powerful man wouldn't care about a simple woman. You were wrong. That window is closed. My people are done with you. Now, the state will begin its work. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving Ethan alone with the sudden, crushing reality of who he had attacked. He had traded a simple crime for absolute, systemic destruction. As Lisandro reached the door, it opened, revealing Chiara. She was pale, her arm rigid in the splint, but her gaze was steady, focused entirely on the man who had tormented her. "Wait," she said, her voice wavering but holding firm. Lisandro paused, recognizing the shift in her stance. He had planned exposure, permanent damage, and public shame. But Chiara had one final, shocking request. "I want him alive," she commanded. "I want him remembered for what he is." Chiara's words hung in the air. "I want him alive. I want him remembered for what he is." Lisandro felt a profound internal shift. His initial plan, born of ruthless, protective instinct, had been absolute erasure, the typical Mafia solution that removed the problem without a trace. But Chiara, bruised and broken, was refusing bloodshed. She wasn't asking for vengeance. She was demanding accountability. She wasn't seeking to mirror the darkness that had consumed her. She was demanding that the light expose it. He looked at her, seeing not just a sister, but a survivor whose moral compass remained fiercely intact despite everything she had endured. Lisandro realized that his love for her wasn't, and shouldn't be, possessive. It had to be protective of her choices, too. This was a moment of critical character development for the crime boss. Honoring Chiara's morality was a stronger act than imposing his own violence. "You want justice, not war," Lisandro summarized, his voice deep with respect. "You want the system to work for the victim, not the abuser." Chiara nodded, her jaw set. "He used silence to control me. He used his connections to make me invisible. I want the world to see him, and I want him to pay with his freedom, not his life." Lisandro gave a curt, approving nod. His entire operation pivoted in that moment. The 6 levers he had pulled, the tax audits, the financial freezes, the legal pressures, were initially designed to cripple Ethan before the final disappearance. Now, those same levers became weapons to weaponize the system itself. They wouldn't bypass the police. They would make the police's job inescapable. Lisandro would ensure that every piece of evidence, every witness, and every financial anomaly necessary for a successful, unappealable conviction was delivered to the authorities on a silver platter. The organized crime boss was about to become the world's most efficient, most intimidating prosecutor. He would not spill blood. He would simply ensure that the law, for once, worked perfectly and ruthlessly for his sister. "Done," Lisandro stated, his commitment absolute. "He chose exposure, and we will honor that choice." He turned to his phone, his quiet commands now focusing on documentation, testimony, and the full, public indictment of Ethan Caldwell. The case was moving into the light, and Ethan was about to face a justice more powerful and permanent than any dark alley revenge. The courtroom air was thick with tension, smelling of old paper and anxiety. Chiara sat in the gallery, her splinted arm a visible testament to the violence, her face resolute. Lisandro sat 2 rows behind her, a silent, tailored statue, his presence an absolute warning to everyone in the room. He was not on the stand. He was not the focus, but every attorney, judge, and witness knew who had orchestrated this flawless, inescapable indictment. Ethan Caldwell, stripped of his connections and his arrogance, looked small and terrified at the defense table. He was no longer the untouchable predator. He was just a man watching his life collapse under the weight of meticulously gathered truth. The trial was swift and brutal. Lisandro's team, working anonymously behind the scenes, had ensured the prosecution was armed with evidence stacked beyond denial. Financial crimes, which were only brought to light because Lisandro had frozen his accounts, suddenly became actionable. Past domestic complaints, which had been quickly dismissed by precinct officers who knew better than to cross certain lines, were now resurfaced and given priority. Witness after witness, former colleagues, landlords, even Ethan's own financial manager, testified, their accounts detailed and damning, all speaking without the usual fear of reprisal. Ethan's isolation was total. His lawyers were under enormous pressure, struggling to defend a client whose entire digital and financial footprint had been meticulously scrubbed clean of any plausible deniability. He had been neutralized not with a bullet, but with paperwork, his own corruption weaponized against him. Chiara watched the proceedings not with triumph, but with a deep, consuming sense of vindication. She was not seeing revenge. She was witnessing the system, for once, working exactly as it was designed to, only because Lisandro had ensured that no one could interfere. Lisandro remained utterly silent, his expression unreadable. His power, usually expressed in whispers and shadows, was now manifesting as absolute legal control. He had kept his promise to Chiara. No blood was spilled, but the reckoning was complete. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The room went silent. Ethan looked toward the door, as if expecting a last-minute rescue that would never come. The foreperson stood. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Ethan Caldwell, guilty. The verdict echoed, final and absolute. Chiara closed her eyes, the single tear that slipped down her cheek, not one of sorrow, but the release of 5 years of silent fear. Justice, cold and inescapable, had finally been delivered. The conviction of Ethan Caldwell was the end of the public fight, but the beginning of Chiara's quiet, private recovery. Weeks later, in a sterile clinic, her cast was finally removed. The skin beneath was pale and scarred, a permanent reminder of the violence, but she was free. Lisandro hadn't been present, choosing instead to send his doctor and security detail. His support was constant, but it was delivered without strings, a protective wall rather than an overbearing hand. He arranged for new housing, a safe, quiet apartment outside the city, and discreet, long-term therapy. Everything was paid for, every logistic handled. It wasn't charity, it was the meticulous fulfillment of the rule. Family is untouchable. One evening, months after the trial, Lisandro visited her new apartment. The two sat in silence at a small kitchen table, the air between them easy for the first time since the night of the text. He got 20 years, Chiara finally said, turning her wrist, testing the range of motion. He got what he earned, Lisandro replied, sipping his coffee. She looked at him, her eyes clear and unburdened by fear. "Why didn't you ever tell me I could come to you?" she asked softly. "Why did you insist on the distance? When things got bad, why did I have to be the one to risk everything by making that desperate mistake?" Lisandro set his cup down, the clink of porcelain the loudest sound in the room. His expression darkened, not with anger, but with memory and regret. "Because power attracts danger," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I wanted you free of it. I had learned, years ago, that the small signs of paranoia were the deadliest. I knew the darkness that follows me, and I wanted your life to be so clean, so anonymous, that my enemies would never look twice." He paused, the heavy meaning of his words hanging between them. "I wanted you safe, Chiara, but in trying to keep you clean, I made you vulnerable. I kept you safe from my world, but I didn't keep you safe in yours." Chiara looked at the man who commanded empires and dismantled governments, and saw a brother haunted by loss. He had taken her burden not just out of sibling duty, but because her terror had reawakened his own grief. "But now," she pressed, "now that he knows you protected me?" Lisandro met her gaze, his eyes sharp with finality. "Now," he said, the quiet authority returning, "you know where safety lives." Chiara leaned back in her chair, a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washing over her. She was not trapped. She was protected. Her mistake had brought the darkness into the light, and now, that darkness was her constant shield. She finally understood. She had lost her anonymity, but she had gained an absolute, unyielding sanctuary. Her life, broken by silence, was rebuilt by a promise. The story spread quietly, not in the screaming headlines of the tabloids, but in the low, resonant whispers of the city's unseen structures. A man who thought he was untouchable vanished from influence without vanishing from the earth. A mafia boss who didn't spill blood but used the law like a perfectly aimed weapon. And a sister who walked away unbroken. Lisandro DePaul returned to his empire changed. The act of pure protection, done without the gratification of violence, had settled a profound, old score within him. He was no less ruthless, but his power was now tempered by a different kind of calculation. He had proved that strength wasn't about what you take, it was about the cold, absolute certainty of what you choose to protect. Chiara Roberto returned to her life, no longer defined by fear. She had her health, her peace, and the unshakable knowledge that when she finally broke her silence, she had been answered by an unyielding force. She had learned that asking for help was not weakness, it was survival. She had traded the false safety of distance for the unassailable fortress of her family's loyalty. The silent streets of New York, where old men played cards and made promises, now held a new, potent truth for those who listened. Lisandro DePaul's greatest weapon was not his reputation, but his love for his sister. That two-word text, sent at 2:14 a.m. to a number never meant for him, hadn't just asked for help. It had summoned it, rewriting 2 lives and an entire history of pain with 2 short, final words. I'm coming. Some messages don't ask for salvation. They simply demand a reckoning. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that one choice can change a life, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to soul-stirring stories for more emotional, deeply human tales like this. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. Leave a comment. What would you have done if you'd found Annabella on that street? Share this with someone who believes love can break through any wall, even the coldest heart. Until next time, stay kind, stay human, stay stirred.